AEW President Tony Khan appeared on the Stone Cold podcast with Steve Austin this past week, or I guess it would be the Steve Austin show. Austin's podcast had been on hiatus for a long time, I think all year, really. This might be his first podcast of the year. So here are some notes coming out of it. The TNT show will be 2 hours and live each week. That's been the rumor, but now it's confirmed. 2 hours and live each week starting this fall. He would not reveal the day of the week just yet, but on Tuesday, there was news online, I saw it on PW Insider, that AEW filed a trademark application for the name Wednesday Night Dynamite. This is after previously, many months ago, applying to trademark Tuesday Night Dynamite. So it is likely that, it's been likely that Tuesday or Wednesday is going to be the night of the week that the show will air. And this new filing may give us our answer as far as which night of the week it's going to be. Now, there will be a tag team tournament. Once the new show debuts, teams will be competing for a first-round bye in the tournament. He thinks, Tony Khan does, that the Young Bucks winning the AAA tag team titles worked out very well, as AAA, in his words, did the best television rating the company has ever done by a wide margin. And he's not wrong. Nearly 5.5 million viewers. AAA's highest audience all year, higher than their previous record by about 1 million viewers. Now think about that. 5.5 million viewers. Raw struggles to stay above 2 million viewers lately. And that's in a country, with AAA, with a far, a smaller population, certainly, than the population that we have here. 5.5 million viewers. He also said that the TV show will emanate from various locations, not just one, like TNA did for so long in the Impact Zone, or NXT does at Full Sail. They're going to move around. Eventually, they'll do some international shows. They will not be focusing much on house shows. He didn't outright say that they would not be doing them, but you could tell he's not really big on them. He doesn't feel they're a big moneymaker. He also doesn't want to just put guys on the road. Part of the appeal, I think, in AEW is the idea that you're not going to be run into the ground like you might be with that WWE road schedule. That's going to be a huge hook, I think, for a lot of guys who might be looking to bounce from WWE to AEW, or somebody who's being recruited by WWE who might instead go to AEW, not just for money reasons, but because the schedule is going to be a little bit easier for them. So he says, even if they do house shows at some point, he's not, guys aren't going to be working 5 to 6 nights a week, at least not for them. And ideally, he would like to get to a point where they're doing between 100 and 120 shows each year. Far less than what WWE does. But you can see where that would have more appeal for somebody. And let's say if you're somebody with a, not a huge name, but you're a name. WWE has shown interest. AEW has shown interest. And let's say by that point, AEW is off and running and they're doing well, live on TNT every week. So you've got the television exposure there. If it comes down to money and schedule, if the money is even comparable, it comes down to schedule. I mean, maybe some guys just want to do nothing but work. Especially if you're a single guy, no kids, no significant other, and all you want to do is just wrestle, there might be a certain appeal in going to WWE and just traveling every week and working every night. But it could come down to schedule. And it could be a case where guys are going to look at that and go, look, I don't want to work that schedule. I'm going to go to AEW. I'll make comparable money for less dates. Hey, sign me up. So you can see where they may have an advantage there. And he also mentioned there will be no off-season. He doesn't think wrestling fans want an off-season. They like their wrestling. They like their wrestling done right. But there will be no off-season in AEW. And I've talked about the whole issue of an off-season before. It's just, AEW is in a position where they might be able to have an easier time at pulling that off. But even they have this television deal now with TNT. I assume it's for 52 weeks of television a year, unless there was some discussion about there being an off-season. Clearly there wasn't. So even AEW now is in a position where if you have a television contract, like WWE has with NBC Universal and with Fox, it is not to do SmackDown 30 weeks a year or 40 weeks a year. Part of the appeal and the reason that Fox sprung for WWE and was so interested and found it so appealing is the fact that it is year round. 52 weeks a year. Unlike any other sport, any other television show. I mean, there are very few television shows that go 52 weeks a year. You know, there's no sport. Baseball doesn't go 52 weeks a year. Football doesn't go 52 weeks a year. The NBA doesn't go 52 weeks a year. TNT is well aware of that. So there's a certain appeal in that. You can't then just turn around and say, hey guys, change of plans here. We're going to change our whole business model and we're going to take 6 weeks off. Or we're going to take 2 months off. That's not how it works. That's why every time somebody brings up the idea of an off season, I don't even really give it much thought anymore because it's not practical. And maybe that's what Tony Khan realized. But the biggest takeaway for me from this interview had nothing to do with Tony Khan. It had nothing to do with AEW. It was what Steve Austin had to say about his disastrous interview with Dean Ambrose on the WWE Network 3 years ago when Ambrose was the WWE champion. Now, you guys have heard me talk about this before, how I thought Austin was wrong for doing what he did, putting Ambrose on the spot like that late in the interview, basically saying that the man is coasting. I think the words he used were resting on his laurels. I'll never forget the look on Dean's face when he said that. He just looked like a deer in headlights. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. You know, if you feel that way, if you've got that kind of criticism, not just for a guy as high up on the food chain as Ambrose was the champion. Austin should know all about that spot because he was in that spot. Long time ago. You take that shit off the air, in private, if you feel that way. You know, like, if an old veteran said something like that to Austin back in his prime, when he was the champion, on live television, in a live television interview, he was blindsided by it, he wasn't expecting it, maybe he doesn't believe it to be true, maybe he feels it's like a character assassination, but here's Bruno Sammartino interviewing him on Bruno's box or whatever his talk show would be. I don't know. Whatever his talk show would be called. And he's telling Steve, and by the way, Bruno was actually no fan of Steve Austin. So I could absolutely picture Austin being infuriated by Bruno calling him out on TV for being, kind of lewd and not being a fan of all the cussing and everything else. But if he called Austin out on TV for something similar, I think you're resting on your laurels. You know, I really would like to see you go out there and be more serious about your job and show more fire and be more of a go-getter. How do you think Austin would have felt about that? He would have flipped his shit. So Austin talked about this, and he said that the interview has haunted him ever since the day that it happened. This is what he had to say, and I want to give a hat tip here to Raj Giri of Wrestling Inc. For putting this transcript together, so I didn't have to write out everything as I was listening to it. But this is what Austin had to say about the podcast interview with Ambrose from, I guess it would have been 3 years ago now. He says, it was a rough podcast. I've been carrying around 1,000 pounds on my back ever since it happened. I felt so bad about that interview, and I was leading it. I take the fault of it because I'm there to get people over and make them come off like $1,000,000. We just came off on the wrong street and kept taking left turns and never got back on track. He had his reasons and I had mine. For all this time, I felt like shit about that interview. People said the Stone Cold podcast got canceled because of how bad that interview was. No, I fulfilled my commitment. That's why the podcast stopped. And Austin noted that Moxley's fans were crapping all over him. Meanwhile, his fans were taking his side. So it was kind of pitting the fans against each other. Austin said he thinks the interview, he thinks about it almost every day. And eventually he was able to get Moxley's phone number from somebody through a mutual friend. He said, we had the best 30-minute conversation because there was never any animosity towards us. I didn't know how he felt about me. I thought he might hate my guts. In fact, that's not true. He said there are times when things just don't click. Like one really bad match he remembers having in WCW against Sting. He said now he's back on the same page with Moxley and that he expects him to actually come down to Los Angeles at some point to do another podcast with him. He says, "This has haunted me for so damn long. People just think I'm this guy and there's this Darth Vader force field around me where I don't feel things. I do. When I've not made somebody look the way they're supposed to look, that haunts me. So now that we're back on the same page, I am looking forward to talking to Jon Moxley." Now, Moxley, I believe it was in the interview he did with Wade Keller, said that he was misled by one of the producers for the network about the podcast. When he told him, he made it very clear to this producer, whoever this person was, because this was the other part of the interview. It wasn't just the part later on where he called him out for resting on his laurels, but earlier, like the first, maybe not half, but like the first 10 or 15 minutes of that interview was absolutely brutal. It was like trying to pull teeth because Austin was trying to go back into this guy's childhood. He was trying to go back into his past. And Ambrose recently in the interview with Keller said that he talked to this producer. He made it very clear he did not want to talk about his early days. He did not want to talk about his childhood. He did not want to talk about his upbringing. There's been stories that, you know, he was out on the streets and horrible things may have happened to him, or his mother was a drug dealer. I don't know how much of that is accurate, but clearly there were things that happened in his youth that have shaped him and that he would rather not think back on and would rather not discuss publicly. So he told this to the producer. He was assured that they would not ask about that. And then the first thing that Austin asked him about was about his upbringing. Now, I don't think Austin did that on purpose. It just sounds to me like there was a breakdown in communication somewhere, and this producer probably, fucked him, basically, or just didn't tell Austin this. And at that point, from there, Ambrose basically just shut down, and the whole thing went off the rails. Then Austin got on him for all the other stuff, towards the end. And that was at a time when, again, Moxley was on this show. He was on WWE's own network as their champion, representing the company. And he even said, at that time, I'm working twice a night because guys are out hurt. I'm working this show in the opening match. I'm going and I'm working this show in the main event. He was the workhorse of the company back then. I think he had set the record that year or the following year for most matches of anybody on the roster. This guy was a beast on this roster. And he's talking about how at the same time I'm being handed crappy scripts with crappy dialogue. And he was in this weird position where he just didn't feel comfortable shitting on the company, which he could have done. Shitting on the company while he was the champion. So he was in a no-win situation. He couldn't open up in the way that he could open up now. Or at least that's how he felt. He was trying to be respectful. He said that if the Austin interview was a phone interview, he would have hung up on him. But he's sitting across from him on live TV. Not a whole lot you can do. You can't just get up and walk away because that's not going to be a good look. And you'll have everybody saying, "Oh, it's an angle. They're building to Austin against Moxley or against Ambrose." Right? That's what people thought when Austin interviewed Brock. That's why Vince McMahon got so pissed at the time. They were teasing a match between Austin and Lesnar that Vince McMahon knew there was no chance of happening. But I thought it was actually very cool of Austin to sort of admit what he did and admit that this has bothered him for so long. He's aware of it. He's very conscious of it, and just take the hit and say, "Look, this went very badly, and I'd like to make up for it." Because I have people argue with me like, "What are you talking about? It really wasn't that bad. You're blowing it out of proportion." And now you have Steve Austin saying that this interview has haunted him for the last 3 years of his life. So clearly something went haywire here in this interview. And I hope he does get Moxley back on the show, and this time they can talk about anything they want without any restrictions.